back to From My Perspective, Taking Theory to Practice. This is the second video in the loose parts series, and today we're going to talk all about loose parts and toddlers. So earlier this week, I asked you two questions. What holds you back, and what would motivate you? Thank you to those who provided great questions, and I'm going to answer them here today, along with some other tips to help you feel more confident in your role as the educator. Make sure to grab your reflective workbook in the show notes because this will support you on reflecting on your practice and creating a plan for staying motivated to continue your loose parts journey with toddlers. Let's get started. Common observations described by educators are that toddlers dump, throw, and mouth the items. These actions are sometimes viewed as a hindrance or not purposeful play. I want to challenge that view. So first, we need to ask ourselves, what is purposeful play? Are we looking at a child's play from their perspective or from our own? Do we see their play as learning and discovery or as destructive and annoying? Reflecting on our views and being honest with ourselves is key. Any changes that we want to make won't happen if we have the wrong perspective. So how do we change that? When we look at the acts of throwing and dumping from a child's perspective, the first thing I go to is Schemas. In her book, Schemas, A Practical Handbook, Laura England states that a schema is often referred to as a pattern of play that is used to describe the repetitive behaviors of young children. They allow young children to construct knowledge and understanding of how the world works. So throwing and dumping would be examples of the trajectory schema. Children are exploring vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines. So when we understand and see their throwing as purposeful, we have a mind shift change, and then we can plan for these patterns in behaviors. Two tips I would suggest for throwing and dumping are, what can they throw and dump? So as I mentioned last week, making sure we have the right kind and number of variables from the theory of loose parts is key to using them in our programs and the children's play. The second tip is, where can they throw and dump? Make a safe place for them to explore this, or plan a provocation around their interest of throwing and dumping. Check out the photos below of some ideas for trajectory play, as well as my Pinterest board for more ideas on this throwing and dumping interest. I want to share a personal story explaining my perspective and the mind shift that I went through when it comes to viewing children's play as purposeful to them. So while running my own program, my little guy loved to crawl through a pile of loose parts, in particular glass stones and shells. He'd be swishing his body all around in it, spreading them all over the floor, making a mess, at least from my original perspective. When I began to learn about his needs and the connections with sensory processing, I quickly changed my perspective and saw his play was purposeful for him because he needed the sensory stimulation that his body was getting from it. The sounds from the items moving, the tactile input from feeling the items on his body, the visual input from engaging with colorful glass stones, and the proprioceptive input from crawling on the floor. He was happy as a clam, swishing all around in it. Especially with toddlers, being open to changing our perspective on what purposeful play is allows us to grow as educators, plan better, and make a more engaging learning environment for everyone. Staying motivated with bringing loose parts into your toddler program is a very real element. The best way that I know how to do this is to share my story with loose parts and what motivated me to keep going. So when I first started embracing loose parts, I ran a mixed age program that had children from 12 months to 3 years. I was very excited, but also unsure and nervous about the safety, cleanup, and storage. I started small and simple, and this was a journey that both the children and I took together. At first, I would only put out juice lids, rocks, shells, and pom-poms on the table. Then, as soon as they were done, I would clean it all right up. Now that I look back, I was completely micromanaging the situation and defeating the whole purpose of loose parts play and how children learn through play. I continued to do research by reading articles and blogs, and I gained lots of inspiration from the Loose Parts Playgroup on Facebook as well. So when I decided to change out the plastic food in our home area, I replaced it with corks, glass stones, pom-poms, and rocks. I no longer had infants at this time in my program. And this was my first glimpse of the magic of loose parts. The play went deeper with the kids asking questions, more problem solving, showing independence, and complex social engagement. This is what motivated me to keep going, and slowly our whole environment had loose parts mixed in with the traditional open-ended resources. Then I wanted to make sure I had a good grasp on the theory of loose parts and not just the physical materials. I have probably read the paper written by Simon Nicholson at least 5 to 6 times in the last year. Each time I read it, I get a different key statement that sticks with me and I reflect on it to see how it appears in my practice. Has my view on loose parts changed over the years? Of course. Reflecting on my practice and being willing to take risks and question what I do is what made me more confident in my role, and this greatly benefited the children. To answer your questions from earlier this week, Heather said she was held back by the melding of loose parts. I talked about this in the previous episode and really tried to focus on making sure that we have the right kind and number of variables in our programs for children to be able to engage in that type of play. Terry asked how to clean and sanitize loose parts. When it comes to the variables such as like metal, plastic, glass, and ceramics, these can be easily sanitized and cleaned within your regulations. Fabrics can go in your washer. You can use a fabric bag to protect them if you need. And then as for packaging items, if they have been mouthed, I would simply put them in recycling and make sure I have a steady supply. As for wood items, depending on your regulations, you could use a natural sanitizer such as vinegar and water and just wipe the materials down with a cloth in the mix. For natural items, I see melding these items as a part of building their immune systems. For safety with size, supervision is needed, but I would just replace them every now and then. The other variables, such as motion, smell, plants, words, and ideas, no cleaning required. I would look at these variables more and see how they're being explored in your programs. That is it for this week's blog post on loose parts and toddlers. I hope I have provided some food for thought and also some practical strategies. Make sure to grab your reflective workbook for this episode and share your reflections in the Facebook group. If you liked this video, please give it a like and share and subscribe to get all the episodes. You will find all the resources I talked about in the show notes below. I will see you next week with a third video in this series, Loose Parts and Preschoolers. Thanks for watching.